Okay, so today our final topic, we're going to be talking about psychological disorders, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they are commonly treated. This is a topic that we could spend a whole class on. In fact, we do have a class here at LCC called Abnormal Psych that covers all this information in a lot more detail. So if you find all this stuff interesting, I recommend taking that. I'm teaching a section of it in the spring. It's usually offered in the winter and or the spring. So yeah, again, if you find this interesting, you want to learn more detail, that would be a good class for you to take. Today, we obviously do not have time to cover every psychological disorder in very much detail. So I'm really going to focus on talking about the ones that are most common, and maybe also some that students often are most interested in. So that's kind of how I picked the ones we'll go over today. We'll start by talking about a resource called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. This is a book that therapists and psychologists use whenever they're trying to diagnose someone with a psychological disorder. And basically the book lays out all of these disorders and has like checklists of different criteria that have to be met in order for someone to be diagnosed. And then it also has, like treatment recommendations and things like that. Like I said, there's a lot of different psychological disorders. We're not going to cover them all today. A lot of them have very complex causes, complex symptoms, complicated treatments. And again, we're not going to go into a ton of detail, so we're just kind of skimming the surface a little bit here today. And kind of one of the things I want to emphasize throughout the class that hopefully all of you agree with and are already aware of is that psychological disorders are just as valid, important as, physical illnesses. So treating them, we really should take the same approach that we do with any kind of medical condition. It turns out that most psychological disorders, really, when you dig down, they have a biological cause to them. There's usually some sort of dysfunction in the brain that's causing a lot of these disorders. So really kind of separating things as psychological versus physical or medical illnesses doesn't make a ton of sense once you start to realize that they actually often have very similar causes and similar roots. Okay, so to start, let's talk a little bit about how psychologists and psychiatrists go about diagnosing psychological disorders. So like I said, they use what's called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, or the DSM for short, so I'll refer to it as the DSM for the rest of this class. Currently, we are on the 5th version of the DSM. So the DSM was originally published in 1952. That's when the first edition came out. And every 5 or 10 years or so, they come out with a new edition that has updates and revisions based on usually research and also just kind of like social and cultural shifts and changes. So just some examples. In the original DSM, homosexuality was actually treated as a psychological disorder. So it would have been listed as a disorder that had symptoms and treatments. At some point, I want to say it was like DSM-3 or maybe even 4, that was removed from the DSM because it was seen that this is not a disorder, this is just, a person's sexual preference. There's no need to diagnose or treat something like that, so it was removed entirely. So those are the kinds of things that often warrant revisions as we have, a cultural shift or understanding of something, and we decide to either remove something or add something, or oftentimes just even changing the language and the wording becomes really important. One thing I want to just caution right here at the beginning, as we start to talk about psychological disorders, all of you are going to have a moment where you're going to be like, that kind of sounds like me. I have that symptom, or I have that whatever, or I have a friend or a sibling that has these symptoms. Maybe they have this disorder. So there's kind of this tendency to want to self-diagnose when we're talking about psychological disorders. Keep in mind, one of the main criteria to be diagnosed with something is that it has to severely impact your day-to-day functioning. So all of us get sad sometimes, right? But is that depression? Probably not. If it's not interfering with your actual day-to-day functioning, then it would not be considered a disorder. So as we go through this, just if you start to have that feeling like maybe I have this, ask yourself, is this interfering with your daily life? Is it stopping you from coming to class? Is it stopping you from going to work? Is it stopping you from having good, meaningful relationships? If it's not that severe, then it's probably not a disorder. So in general, kind of as I was saying, things are considered a disorder if it causes a significant disturbance in thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. There has to be some identifiable dysfunction, either biologically or psychologically. Has to lead to significant distress, as I was saying, so it has to cause impairments in your day-to-day life. And it has to be outside of what is sort of culturally normal or expected. So you could even say, like during COVID, a lot of us experienced probably symptoms of things that we had never really experienced before: loneliness, isolation, sadness. But in that moment, that became kind of the cultural norm. So you might not necessarily have been diagnosed with something because, we have this very obvious cause. There's this whole global pandemic that's causing everyone to be isolated. So probably that's not a disorder. That's just a function of the current environment. So you always got to also take into account kind of the context of the individual where all of this is happening. So I was kind of talking about this earlier, but we've had a lot of historical shifts in what is considered a psychological disorder or not. There's, like I said, things that have been added to the DSM that weren't there originally. One example of that would be like autism spectrum disorder. So that was something we didn't really necessarily know about until, maybe like 1960s or so. So I don't think autism spectrum disorder would have been in the first iteration of the DSM because we just didn't really know what autism was or how to classify or diagnose that. So at some point it would have been added. And then, like I said, there's often revisions to language and kind of specific details. Okay. So this graph, I know this is kind of hard to read, especially if you're in the back, but this kind of breaks down some of the most common psychological disorders and how prevalent they are. I will say this graph comes from, I want to say like 2008, so these numbers are a little bit outdated. I would guess that pretty much all of these have gone up since that time. So whatever the numbers are here, you can imagine that now they're probably higher, again, especially probably during like COVID and some of the things that have been happening over the past 5 years or so have led to increased rates of a lot of these disorders. The most common one of the ones we'll talk about first is major depressive disorder. Substance abuse disorders, things like alcohol and other drugs are very common. Various kinds of anxieties, so fears like phobias, anxiety disorders. Those tend to be the most prevalent in our culture and our society. So like I said, today we'll talk about some of those most common ones, and then also a couple ones that maybe aren't necessarily common, but that students often are interested in learning about. Another thing to keep in mind as we talk about these disorders is that people often are diagnosed with more than one disorder. And we call that a comorbidity. So if you have one disorder and then you're also diagnosed with another or several others on top of that, we say that those illnesses are comorbid. So for example, there's a pretty high comorbidity between obsessive compulsive disorder and major depressive disorder. So about, 40, there's about a 41% overlap there in terms of the number of people who are diagnosed with both of those. And those comorbidities make things very complicated. It makes it more difficult to diagnose because now you have a much more complex sort of set of symptoms that you're looking at. It also makes treatment very difficult in some cases because there may be some treatments that might help major depressive disorder but actually make the OCD worse or vice versa. So trying to treat someone who has these comorbidities becomes very complex. So that's just another thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we start to talk about these various disorders. Another thing I hope you kind of take from today's lecture is that we often use terms from this area in our everyday language in kind of incorrect ways. So some of you might sometimes have said yourself or heard someone else say like, oh, that person's so OCD. They need to be clean, they're obsessed with organization, they're OCD or whatever. And it turns out that that's probably not the case. If you have a friend who just likes for their room to be really tidy or whatever, they probably do not actually have obsessive compulsive disorder. Because again, I would guess it's probably not interfering with their day-to-day life and functioning. We could have a whole discussion about what impact does that have when we use language like that, right? If we say someone's OCD when they're actually not, is that having some sort of negative repercussion on that person? Is it negative towards people who actually do have OCD? Maybe. It's just something, again, to kind of keep in mind as we learn about these various disorders today. Okay, so we can start. So another thing to say, the DSM classifies these disorders in kind of like groups or clusters. So one of the most common groups of disorders are called mood disorders. And the thing that all these disorders have in common, that should be obvious from the name, is that they affect our mood. Either they make our mood, sort of at an extreme negative or an extreme positive, or a combination of both. So the most common mood disorder is called major depressive disorder. For someone to be diagnosed with this, they basically have to have a depressed mood most of the day, every day, for at least 2 weeks. So oftentimes the DSM will lay out a specific number of criteria you have to meet, and then also a certain length of time, and then, in order that you could then be diagnosed with this disorder. So for at least 2 weeks, you have to have, things like, obviously when we think of depressive disorder, probably what you think of is sadness, right? And that is a key part of depression. People who are depressed, they often have a low mood. They feel sad frequently, but there's a lot of other components to depression as well. So a lot of people who are depressed, they may have a lack of motivation. They may find it very hard just to even get out of bed in the morning. They may have a hard time, getting the motivation to shower, to clean their surroundings. They also tend to lack enjoyment in the things that they used to find enjoyable. So if they used to really like playing a sport or, going and spending time with friends, or they enjoyed cooking or whatever it might be, now when they do those things, that doesn't bring them any joy anymore. They just feel kind of flat and, not necessarily happy most of the time. They also tend to have kind of a hopelessness. So people with major depressive disorder, they feel the way that I just described, and they also tend to believe that they're not going to get better, that they're going to feel that way for the rest of their lives. So there's this kind of hopelessness even as they try to look into the future. So those are some of the main symptoms that, again, in order to be diagnosed, you would have to have those symptoms pretty much all day, every day for 2 weeks at least, in order to be considered major depressive disorder. The other thing, too, that therapists will look for if they're trying to diagnose that is they try to rule out grief and things like that. So if you've just lost a job or gone through a divorce, or someone close to you has passed away and you've experienced some of these symptoms for 2 weeks, you probably would not be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, because in that case the therapist would say, no, you're just experiencing normal grief in response to a life event. So you also have to have these symptoms kind of in isolation without some sort of triggering event or context. The next mood disorder is called bipolar disorder, and there's actually 2 different kinds of bipolar disorder. So there's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. The thing that they have in common in both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, the person will experience what's called a manic episode. And a manic episode you can think of almost like the opposite of depression. So someone who is in a state of mania, they often will have intense feelings of euphoria. They'll feel almost like high, just like extremely joyful and energetic. But they often will become very erratic and impulsive in their behavior. They often will be very grandiose. They'll have these visions that they can do something amazing and accomplish something that they don't have any reason to think they should be able to accomplish. So someone who's in a manic episode, for example, they might decide that, they're gonna switch careers and they're gonna start a new job that they've never done anything like that before. They might decide they're gonna move across the country without any funding or anything that's gonna help them do that. So they'll make these very grand, impulsive decisions, thinking that everything's gonna be great, everything's gonna work out fine, even though they don't have the resources, or skills available to actually do that. They also can become irritable and aggressive, potentially, during those manic episodes. They typically will have sleep disturbances. They may not sleep at all for days on end. So this very, high manic state that they get into. So someone with bipolar 1 disorder, they basically, they have severe swings from mania to that depressive symptom. So someone with bipolar 1, that's what you think of probably when you think of bipolar disorder. They kind of swing back and forth from the manic episodes to the depressive episodes. And in the depressive episodes, they have all the same symptoms I talked about with major depressive disorder. And then with bipolar 2, they just have those manic episodes and none of the depressive episodes. So those are the two main mood disorders. There are some others in the DSM, but again, those are kind of the most common ones. So some of the causes for both of these mood disorders, we know that there's a pretty strong genetic component, and you'll hear me say that kind of repeatedly throughout today. A lot of these psychological disorders we know have a strong genetic component. Most of the reason we know that comes from studies on twins. So if you look at identical twins and see how much overlap there is in diagnoses between them compared to just like normal siblings, you'll see that twins often have a lot of overlap in psychological disorders. So if one twin is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, there's a pretty high chance that the other twin will develop it as well. And that's true even for twins that have been like separated at birth and who are being raised in very different environments as well. We also know, so this might be related to that genetic component, but people who have these mood disorders, they tend to have imbalances in specific neurotransmitters, particularly norepinephrine and serotonin. Serotonin will be affected in both of these pretty drastically. And then norepinephrine is basically like adrenaline. It's the neurotransmitter that basically regulates how alert you are. In someone with major depressive disorder, they will have low norepinephrine, which makes sense, right? They're kind of tired all the time. They have no motivation. They don't want to get up and do things. Someone with bipolar disorder, especially when they're in that manic state, they have high levels of norepinephrine. So it's kind of almost like they're in an adrenaline rush when they're in that manic episode. And we'll talk about treatment in the next PowerPoint. I kind of wish I had put those together for this quarter. Last quarter, I separated these out into 2 separate lectures on 2 different days. Now that I'm doing it in the same day, I kind of wish I would have just like put the treatment here, but I've got it separated in another PowerPoint. So we'll talk about treatment in just a little bit. So those are mood disorders. The next class of disorders that are also fairly common are anxiety disorders. So anxiety disorders are characterized by persistent fear and anxiety, as the name implies. And again, we have quite a few different specific ones. So one anxiety disorder that's very common is called specific phobia. And specific phobia is basically where someone has an intense, irrational fear of a particular stimulus. And there are, you could really have a specific phobia about pretty much anything you can imagine, but there are, of course, some that are more common. So some of the common ones would be phobias of like different animals and creatures, so like spiders, snakes, sharks, etc. Things like, environmental, so like being scared of heights, being scared of flying, enclosed spaces. Those are all also very common. Things like phobias of needles or medical procedures. Those are some of the most common specific phobias. And again, a lot of you probably, self-diagnose as having a phobia, but you got to ask yourself, does it interfere with your day-to-day functioning? I would say it becomes a phobia if, again, it's preventing you from going to class, going to school, interacting with your friends. Like you might be scared of spiders, but let's say, hypothetically, like you saw a spider in this room right now, right? And there's like up in this corner far away from you where it's not going to touch you or get to you. Would you like run out of the room and leave and never come back to class again? Right? If it's that severe to where like you're never going to come to this class again because there's a spider there and you're scared of it, then that might be a phobia. But if it just like makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but you can sit there and take your notes and ignore it, then I probably wouldn't say that could be diagnosed as a diagnosable phobia. So again, it's another word we tend to use in our common everyday language that's not being used necessarily in the most accurate way. Another common anxiety disorder is social anxiety disorder. So someone with social anxiety disorder, they're basically scared of any situation where they have to interact with someone socially. They are particularly scared of things like public speaking, so getting up in front of a crowd and talking. Oftentimes, people with social anxiety disorder, they worry that the people they interact with are going to have negative judgments of them. that people are going to think that they're boring or they're stupid or they're, whatever. So that often is what drives a lot of that anxiety, is that they try to avoid any social situation where they might be, negatively judged by someone else. And oftentimes people with social anxiety disorder get themselves in this kind of self-destructive loop of sorts, where it's like they have social anxiety, they want to interact with other people, but anytime they start to put themselves into that situation, the anxiety kicks in, which might make them act a little bit awkwardly around other people. And so since they act awkward, that interaction might not go the best way. And then that triggers more anxiety because now they've had this negative experience, and then it just kind of loops in on itself, and they get more anxious and more awkward and more anxious and more awkward. And it can be very difficult to kind of pull themselves out of that loop of anxiety. Another anxiety disorder is called panic disorder. So someone with panic disorder, they suffer from chronic panic attacks. And during a panic attack, essentially what happens is the person has a lot of physical symptoms. So they might feel their heart rate start to increase, they might start sweating, they might become really jittery and fidgety. And internally, they often are feeling as though they have this intense fear that they're going to die or that something really bad is going to happen. Oftentimes, people who are having a panic attack, they think that they're having a heart attack or that they're going to have a heart attack. But if you look at their actual vitals, if you look at their heart, they're perfectly fine. There's nothing actually happening, but they feel as if they're about to die, or there's some impending doom, basically that's coming. Usually those panic attacks only last for maybe 10 minutes at the most. But to the person having the panic attack, it can feel like an eternity because they're in this really negative, panic state. So it feels like a really, really long time when it's actually not. So that would be one panic attack. Someone with panic disorder, they have to have those panic attacks chronically over a certain period of time. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but that's something that would be in the DSM. You have to have this many panic attacks over this amount of time in order to be, actually diagnosed with the disorder. And then the final one I'll talk about today is called generalized anxiety disorder. Someone with generalized anxiety disorder, they just feel anxious kind of all the time. They tend to worry about everything. It's not about something specific, so it's not a specific phobia. They might be anxious in social situations, but they're also going to be anxious in a lot of other situations as well. They tend to worry maybe about specific things. So they might worry, that they left the oven on, or that they didn't lock the doors, or things like that. They may worry about other people frequently, like if a loved one leaves the house to go somewhere, they may be worried that something bad is going to happen, that person's going to get in a car accident or whatever. So they're just constantly kind of anxious and worried about everything, essentially. And often that worry is pointless. It's not something that's going to help, and it's often uncontrollable. So even if they try to calm themselves down, if they try to stop thinking about whatever it is they're worrying about, they can't do that. It's just they ruminate on whatever it is that they're worried about. So those are the anxiety disorders. I don't have the cause listed here. Some of this is due to overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system. So we've talked about sympathetic nervous system quite a bit. Remember, that's the thing that triggers your fight or flight response. So it makes sense if someone has an overactive sympathetic nervous system, then they kind of perceive everything as a threat, or they perceive things as a threat that aren't actually threatening. And so then that can manifest as these various kinds of anxiety disorders. Okay, next up, kind of related to anxiety disorders, are trauma and stress disorders. There's two major ones we'll talk about here. So the first is called acute stress disorder. And acute stress disorder is usually triggered by something that happens. And usually what triggers acute stress disorder is anything that threatens our bodily safety. So something that threatens our health or life, essentially. And someone with acute stress disorder, they have symptoms that are very similar to the next one, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So these two disorders, they have basically the same symptoms. The difference between them is the amount of time that they last. So the symptoms that they have in common, people who have either of these stress disorders, they will often have flashbacks to whatever caused the stress in the first place. And those flashbacks are not just memories, so we all can like maybe remember something bad that happened to us, but someone who's having a flashback, they actually feel as if they're reliving that moment. So it's not just that they're remembering it, but it's like everything in their body is telling them that that thing is happening again, even if they're in a safe space. They will often have intrusive thoughts about whatever it is that happened to them, and it kind of like I was saying with worrying, they can't stop those thoughts, they just sort of ruminate. They often will avoid anything that might trigger those thoughts. So kind of like the classic example is someone who's gone into like a military experience, has maybe had like a firefight or something like that where their life was threatened. And a trigger might be anything that sounds like a gunshot. So like fireworks or things like that might trigger a flashback or those intrusive thoughts. So they will often go out of their way to avoid anything that could potentially be triggering. So they might not engage in normal like social interactions or social situations. They might even avoid work or class or whatever it might be if they feel like there might be a trigger in that context or that situation. They also sometimes feel guilt about whatever it is that caused the trauma, even if whatever it is clearly not their fault whatsoever. They may feel guilt or shame about what it is that happened. And so again, both acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, they'll have all of those symptoms. With acute stress disorder, those symptoms will last for 4 weeks or less. So acute stress disorder is usually like right after the event and it's pretty short. Post-traumatic stress disorder is where it's lasting longer than 4 weeks. So if it goes longer than 4 weeks, we call that post-traumatic stress disorder. The cause of this, especially post-traumatic stress disorder, it's been shown that there are changes in the hippocampus, which is an area we've talked about before that's important for encoding memories. So basically the idea is that whenever you have this traumatic situation, the hippocampus is overactive, and so it kind of like, overly stores that memory of whatever the traumatic thing is. So then it's like that memory is so powerful in the brain that you can't stop thinking about it, you can't stop ruminating on it, and it becomes kind of like the central focus of the person's day-to-day life. All right, next up, we're just kind of like moving through these quickly. Feel free at any point if you have questions or anything, just let me know. Next up, we have the obsessive compulsive disorders, which this is a class of disorders which includes OCD, but then there's also some other kind of related disorders that are similar in some ways. So the main disorder in this class is, of course, obsessive compulsive disorder itself, or OCD. So someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, essentially what they have is they have obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are frequent intrusive thoughts. Usually someone with OCD, they're going to have obsessions about a specific thing. So someone, for example, might have OCD about cleanliness, and so their obsessions are going to revolve around that. So they're going to constantly have intrusive thoughts about like germs. They may, have these obsessive thoughts that like their hands aren't clean enough or the surfaces around them aren't clean enough. So the obsessions are the internal thoughts that they're having. And then compulsions are behaviors that they do to try to minimize those obsessive thoughts. So someone with real OCD that's diagnosable, they may, for example, wash their hands like 20 times before they'll leave the bathroom. So a normal person, you go, you use the bathroom, you wash your hands once, for 30 seconds or whatever, then you go about your day and you forget about it. Someone with OCD, they'll go use the bathroom and then they'll wash their hands once and maybe they'll start to leave and then they'll think like, no, that's not enough, I need to wash again. And they'll sit there and they'll do that over and over again, maybe wash their hands 20 times or something before they can finally leave the bathroom. And then even then, they still might obsess about it. They might sit there and just be thinking like, oh, I feel like I didn't wash my hands enough. I'm going to get out some sanitizing, hand sanitizer or whatever and sort of keep cleaning. So they really truly cannot stop themselves from those compulsive behaviors. And again, kind of the idea is that those compulsions help relieve some of the obsession. So the more that they engage in whatever behavior, that helps to kind of minimize those obsessive, intrusive thoughts that they have. So some of the most common ones, is like germs and sanitation. Also things like symmetry, so they may very obsessively try to organize things in a way that's like constantly symmetrical. They may worry, may have worries kind of similar to generalized anxiety disorder. So they might worry like, did I leave the oven on when I left the house? Did I lock the doors when I left the house? But then they will have these compulsions to try to minimize that. So they might, again, have to lock the house like 20 times before they can finally leave and feel confident that they did it. So those compulsive behaviors are a huge component of OCD. Again, like with a lot of these other disorders, there seems to be a pretty strong genetic predisposition. And then there's some evidence that they have a hyperactive orbitofrontal cortex, which is mostly, that area of the brain is kind of involved in like self-monitoring. And so it seems like they have this overactive part of their brain that's just kind of constantly doubting themselves, basically. Another disorder that's in this same like family of disorders is body dysmorphia. So someone with body dysmorphia, it's kind of almost like they have OCD about a flaw in their body. So someone with body dysmorphia, usually they have like some flaw that they're obsessed with that other people don't even notice or can't perceive. So they may obsess about their skin. They may think that like their skin is, has too many blemishes or is too dry or whatever. They may obsess about more like physique things, like they may think that they don't have enough musculature, or they may think that they're overweight when they're actually not. And then, so they have these obsessive thoughts about that flaw, but then they also have sort of compulsive behaviors to try to minimize that flaw as well. So they may obsessively clean their face more than, other people normally would. They may obsessively work out more than normal or what is healthy. At the extreme end, people with body dysmorphia may also pursue like plastic surgeries, and even like repeated plastic surgeries to try to fix whatever the perceived flaw is that they think that they have. And then the final one in this family is hoarding disorder. So someone with hoarding disorder, they have obsessions and compulsions that are based around material possessions. So they will accumulate, lots of stuff basically in their household to the point that they can no longer function in their house anymore. Common things that they may collect would be things like newspapers, magazines, things that most people would normally consider trash, things like empty boxes, empty bags, empty containers. So they'll just collect all of these things. And it will get to the point where, again, all of us might have like a drawer somewhere where you've got a few extra bags tucked away or, a few boxes tucked away just in case you ever need them or whatever. But someone with hoarding disorder, it gets to the point where these items are filling up all of their spaces. So it's in their bedrooms, it's in their living room, it's in their kitchen, it's kind of everywhere. And they have kind of these obsessive thoughts that if they were to throw this thing away, something bad is going to happen. Either they're going to be perceived as really wasteful, or often they will have some kind of sentimental attachment to an object. So they'll think, okay, if I throw this away, then I'm dishonoring this memory of something that this object is attached to. Or they might think, okay, if I throw this away, then tomorrow I'm going to need it. I'm going to throw away this box, and then tomorrow there's going to be something that I need this box for. So they have like these obsessive thoughts about what could go wrong if they get rid of these items. Any questions so far? We've got a few, maybe 3 or 4 more kind of groups of disorders. All right. So far the ones we've talked about have been kind of the most common. We've been going in order that way. So we started with mood disorders are really common, anxiety disorders, and these obsessive compulsive disorders. Now we're going to talk about a few that maybe aren't as common, but again, that students often kind of find interesting and want to learn a little bit about. So next up we have schizophrenia, which is not very common at all. This occurs in maybe like 1% or less of the population overall. So schizophrenia is characterized, in the DSM they break it down into what they call positive symptoms and negative symptoms, but that does not mean good or bad. Instead it means positive symptoms are where the person has something kind of like additional that other people don't have. And the negative symptoms are where it's like something has been taken away, basically. So think of positive as adding and negative as subtracting. So the positive symptoms are usually what you probably think of if you think of someone with schizophrenia. So that would be things like hallucinations and delusions. So hallucinations are perceptual experiences that someone with schizophrenia has. The most common kind of hallucinations they have are auditory. So about 50% of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, they will often hear voices and other kind of auditory hallucinations. And those voices can vary quite a bit. Sometimes they might hear the voice of someone they actually know. Sometimes it might be kind of like a made-up character that doesn't exist in reality. Sometimes that voice might be something like a demon or an angel or something, kind of mythical like that. The voices can sometimes be positive in the sense that they're like good, that they encourage them, they praise them. But a lot of times those voices can be negative in the sense that they are, critical. They might even be directing the person with schizophrenia to do something harmful to themselves or other people. So those hallucinations can take on all kinds of various forms. They also do sometimes have visual hallucinations, but that's a lot less common. So only about maybe 15% of people with schizophrenia will actually have visual hallucinations. And then they can even have things like, sensory like touch hallucinations. They can have smell and taste hallucinations as well. Pretty much any sensory modality they could potentially have hallucinations in. But the most common by far are auditory. In addition to that, they also often have delusions, which delusions are these false, irrational beliefs or thought patterns that they have. So, for example, people with schizophrenia often will have kind of delusions of grandeur, which means that they see themselves as this almost like godlike status. So they kind of might think that they have powers or abilities they don't actually have. They also sometimes have delusions of persecution. So they believe that other people are pursuing them or after them or trying to stop them or hurt them in some way. They may believe, for example, that like the government is after them for some reason. They may have delusions about having kind of like superpowers. So they might think that they can read other people's minds or that they can broadcast their thoughts to other people. So just all these, delusions that are really breaks from reality is kind of the main theme of schizophrenia. They also have very disorganized thinking and speech patterns. So if you have a conversation with someone with schizophrenia, it can be very difficult to follow what they're talking about. They may kind of, like if you ask them a question, they might circle around the question and never really quite get to the answer or the point. They may produce what's called word salad, which is kind of like if you remember when we talked about aphasia, and we talked specifically about Wernicke's aphasia. So word salad is that where you're producing something that sounds like speech, like it's rhythmic and there's words in there, but the words don't make any sense together. It's not coherent at all. So they have very disorganized thinking. They also have disorganized behavior. So they may pace around a lot. They may have like very fidgety, strange movements. Often people with schizophrenia, they will play with their hair a lot, or they'll do just like weird sort of fidgety behaviors constantly. And they can also go the opposite end where they become like catatonic, where they basically just don't move at all, don't respond to anything at all. So most of what I just described would be the positive symptoms. So hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, those are called positive because it's like the addition of something. They're seeing things that aren't actually there. They're thinking things that aren't actually real. The negative symptoms are where we have a decrease in behavior in some way. So a lot of times people with schizophrenia have a flattened affect or flattened emotional expression. So even if, something really sad or traumatic happens, they're not going to, frown, they're not going to cry. If something hilarious happens, they're not going to smile or respond. They basically just are unresponsive emotionally. They also tend to have decreased motivation and just reduced speech overall. So again, just kind of unresponsive. Okay, some of the causes. So again, we know there's a pretty strong genetic component. And also schizophrenia is one where they've identified that certain prenatal events might make you more predisposed. So for example, there was a study that showed that if the mother got like the flu or some other illness in the first trimester of pregnancy, then that child is more likely to go on to develop schizophrenia later. So any kind of stress early on in pregnancy might increase chances of schizophrenia. As far as like in the brain, it's been shown that they have overactive dopamine and just abnormal brain anatomy, basically. So essentially people with schizophrenia that overall have less brain volume. So their brain tends to be smaller and like have less neurons. There are structures in the brain called ventricles, which are kind of like these holes in the middle of the brain where fluid flows through that allows, like your brain to drain waste and things like that. People with schizophrenia, they have larger ventricles. So again, less brain volume, kind of bigger holes. There's some evidence that certain substances, particularly chronic marijuana use, can increase the risk of developing schizophrenia. So someone who smokes it, on like a daily basis for a long period of time is more likely to have at least symptoms of schizophrenia and then maybe possibly to develop the full disorder. Like I said, it's very rare. And so a lot of researchers think you have to have kind of like this perfect storm that all comes together in order to actually produce schizophrenia. So you probably have to have the genetic predisposition and some stress in like early childhood and also, some sort of substance use. And if you combine all of those, then that's going to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia. Usually it develops in like adolescence and young adulthood. Okay. So that's schizophrenia. There are a couple other related disorders in the DSM, and they're basically just kind of different versions of schizophrenia that have either like more minor symptoms or that last for a shorter period of time. To be diagnosed with schizophrenia, you have to have at least 2 of these symptoms for at least 6 months. And so there's others that are like kind of similar, but it's more like having just like an episode of these symptoms that are listed in the DSM. Okay, next up, another very rare disorder are called dissociative disorders. And this is again kind of a class of disorders. We've got a few different ones. So the first is dissociative amnesia, and this is where a person temporarily has an inability to recall things about their own identity. So you kind of often see this in like movies or TV shows where maybe someone gets hit on the head or something like that, and they wake up and they can't remember their name, they can't remember where they are, what year it is. So that would be kind of like an example of dissociative amnesia. Usually, like I said, that's something that happens after some kind of traumatic experience, a car accident, a concussion, things like that. And usually this will resolve on its own over the period, a pretty short period of time. After like, a few days or so, the person's memory will come back. Another dissociative disorder is called depersonalization, or sometimes called derealization. This is where essentially the person has feelings where they become very unfamiliar with themselves and their surroundings, and they feel it's almost kind of like an out-of-body experience is what some people describe it as. So they feel as if like they're not really operating their own body, but more like they're kind of watching themselves in a movie. And so they feel like this, like they're depersonalized, like they're not themselves anymore. Sometimes people can describe it as like almost like being in a fog or a dream state, and like kind of feeling like the world around them isn't real or it's artificial in some way. And again, usually this is triggered by something. So it could be a traumatic event. It's also a symptom of like burnout. So if someone is overworking themselves and like exhausted and really stressed out, they may have these periods of depersonalization or derealization. And again, usually something that resolves on its own over time. So those two are maybe somewhat common compared to the next one I'm going to talk about. Because again, they're usually triggered by some kind of trauma. So if someone has a car accident or something like that, then they might experience one of these. But the third one is called dissociative identity disorder. That's kind of the main disorder in this class. And this one is much less common. And a lot of you may refer to this as like split personalities or multiple personalities. Again, it's something that's kind of shown sometimes in movies or TV shows. So this is basically where, like I said, someone takes on multiple personalities. So they have kind of their core identity that they operate as normally most of the time, but then they can switch to like being an entirely different person, and that other person will have a different name, totally different identity, like different musical preferences and movie preferences, and maybe even a different voice. They may even be a different gender, and they may have multiple of those that are kind of inhabiting one body. So again, this is something you often see in like movies or TV shows. There's a lot of controversy about whether it's actually real or not. So there are some cases that have been diagnosed, and then later, whoever diagnosed it finds out that actually the person was making this up in order to avoid consequences of something that they did. So maybe they committed a crime or something, then they might try to claim that they didn't commit that crime, it was their alter ego that actually committed the crime, and so therefore they shouldn't suffer the consequences. So in a lot of cases, it's turned out that that's what was driving their behavior, is that they were kind of faking it. But there are also some cases that have been diagnosed and it wasn't, uncovered that they're faking it in some way. So there's a lot of controversy about whether it should even be in the DSM and whether it's a real disorder or not. So who knows? It's kind of one of these things too, sometimes in psychology, there's like these trendy disorders. So there was a movie in the 1980s that had like a plot line that revolved around someone having multiple personalities. And after that, they found that there was like this huge increase in the number of people being diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. So it's almost like they were just sort of copying a movie that they saw, and that the psychologists diagnosing them were maybe also, like being influenced by things that were happening in the culture around them. So that one's pretty controversial. If it is real, it's probably extremely, extremely rare. So the cases of it really happening are probably like a handful of them. Okay, 2 more classes of disorders, and then we'll talk briefly about therapy and treatment options for these. So next we'll talk about personality disorders. And in the DSM, these personality disorders are broken up into 3 clusters. So they're called Cluster A, Cluster B, and Cluster C. Cluster A personality disorders tend to be people who are odd and eccentric and awkward. They tend to be kind of like loners, people who willingly choose to isolate themselves from others. So they don't really engage in social activities. They also tend to be kind of like paranoid or suspicious, so they don't really trust the people around them. They often think that other people are, just trying to use them or, have like malicious intent. That's cluster A. Also say each of these clusters, if you were to look in the DSM, there's like 3 or 4, personality disorders listed in each cluster, but we're not going to go into that much detail in this class, at least not for all of these. Some of them, I have some of them listed, but. Cluster B consists of people who are very impulsive, neurotic, erratic, and also people in Cluster B tend to basically just kind of like disregard the rights of others. So people in this cluster are more likely to do things like lie or cheat or steal, and they often do not feel like guilt or remorse for doing those things that most people would consider morally wrong. Some of the disorders that are listed in here are things like borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Let's actually start with, antisocial personality disorder, you may hear that in like common language referred to as psychopaths or sociopaths. So if you ever hear those words in the DSM, it's called antisocial personality disorder. So people with antisocial personality disorder, like I was saying, they tend to violate the rights of others. They will lie, cheat, steal to get what they want and have zero remorse for doing so. They can sometimes be aggressive and violent, although it's not super common. So most of us, when we think of psychopaths and sociopaths, you might immediately jump to like serial killer, murderer. So I will say probably every serial killer was antisocial personality disorder, but it's not the case that everyone with antisocial personality disorder is a serial killer, right? Does that make sense? So most people who have antisocial personality disorder are not going to do something aggressive or violent, but they will do other horrible things, like I said, like lying, cheating, stealing, etc. In general, they just tend to like violate the rights and boundaries of other people around them without any remorse or shame. People with borderline personality disorder They have some similar patterns, but they often will oscillate, like their emotions are very erratic and unstable. So one moment they might be super like loving and affectionate and kind, and then the next moment they're hostile and aggressive and mean, and they'll jump back and forth between those two often. And they also, people with borderline personality disorder are very fearful of like abandonment or rejection. And so they will manipulate the people around them to try to keep them close, basically. So they will do or say anything they can to keep the people around them from leaving. They'll do whatever they can to stop people from ending a relationship. So that's cluster B. And then cluster C, people in this cluster tend to be nervous and fearful, basically very, very shy, like to a point that's pathological, basically. So in this class, we have a personality disorder called avoidant personality disorder. And basically with people with that disorder, they will, it's kind of almost like a social anxiety disorder, except it's longer term. So someone with social anxiety disorder, they have to have those symptoms for, maybe a few weeks or months to be diagnosed with it. But in order to be diagnosed with a personality disorder version, you have to have a pattern of that behavior over like the entire lifespan, basically. But in general, people in that cluster, kind of similar. They tend to avoid social situations. When they're in a social situation, they're very fearful of rejection. They're fearful of other people judging them negatively. So they tend to, not pursue social situations a lot. In cluster C, there's also one called dependent personality disorder, which is where someone does not really have a strong identity of their own. And they are very bad at making decisions, so they're very indecisive. So they depend on all the people around them to kind of give them personality, give them an identity, and make their decisions for them. So they might like very quickly cling on to another person. They might meet someone and immediately decide like, you're my best friend, and then they'll copy everything that person does. So they'll copy their music preferences, their style of clothing, etc., because they can't really form an identity of their own. So those are the personality disorders. And then lastly, we have the neurodevelopmental disorders. We already talked about ADHD in this class, right? At some point, I feel like we did. I might be thinking of my developmental class.
When we talked about addiction, we did.
Yeah, there you go, yeah. It's like motivation, yeah. We talked about addiction and ADHD, so. I thought we had, so I didn't want to go into too much detail about it. I mostly just put it here because it is one of the neurodevelopmental disorders. The other one, though, that we didn't talk much about is autism spectrum disorder. So that would be included in this. So neurodevelopmental disorders are disorders that usually start in childhood, and then they usually, persist with the person for the rest of their life. Most of the other disorders we've talked about don't develop until like adulthood. So neurodevelopmental disorders are a little bit unique in that they usually start in childhood. So people with autism spectrum disorder, some of the main things that they have difficulty with social interaction. Usually early on, you might notice, as they're developing as like an infant and a toddler, they often have very delayed language. So they may not speak their first word until much later than other children do. And then even once they speak their first word, they won't be very communicative verbally. They tend to lack a lot of just like the normal social dynamics that most people have. They don't make eye contact. They're not very responsive to other people. And then in addition to that, they often will be hyper-focused on something that they get kind of obsessive about. So like a little kid with autism, maybe they become obsessed with trains. And that's like the only thing that they can talk about or play with or think about, and they won't engage with any other activity or anything else. They also sometimes have like very repetitive movements. They're obsessed with like routine, or they're very affected by routine. So these things need to be the same exactly from day to day. If they're not, if there's any deviation in routine, then they often will act out emotionally. They may become very upset by that. So in general, kind of the main things are they have difficulties with social interaction, and they have these like repetitive, obsessive behaviors that they engage in. I'll also say, so one of the things that's been changed a few times in the DSM is the way that we classify autism. So it used to be broken up into multiple disorders, like there was, Asperger's syndrome was one of them. There was autism, and like the autism was broken up even into like other categories. Now it's called a spectrum disorder. So in the DSM, it's called autism spectrum disorder, which means that you can range from like low severity to high severity. So people who have less severe autism tend to be very functional and independent. They might just be a little bit like socially awkward and have kind of obsessive tendencies, but other than that, they're able to operate and function, pretty normally. People at the more severe end, they basically have no independence whatsoever. They have to have someone taking care of them, even into adulthood, because they have a lot more severe dysfunction. Some of the causes of autism, again, we already talked about ADHD quite a bit, so I won't go into that. But with autism, again, we know there's a pretty strong genetic component. And then there's also specific abnormalities in the brain. They tend to have a less developed prefrontal cortex. And then there are specific neurons. I can't remember if we talked about these, but there are neurons called mirror neurons in the brain. And mirror neurons basically respond whenever, like if I'm doing something or if I'm watching someone else do the same thing, then those mirror neurons would respond in both cases. So like if I'm hammering a nail, there's certain neurons in my brain that are firing that allow me to do that. If they're mirror neurons, then those same neurons will also fire whenever I watch someone else hammer a nail. So those are really important for helping me learn how to like mimic other people's behavior, also learning just how to read other people's intentions. So they help me figure out, okay, if this person has a hammer, they have it lifted up like this, and there's a nail right there, then they're probably about to hit that nail, right? It helps me kind of anticipate what someone else is doing. So that's really important for social interaction. So people with autism, they tend to have less of those mirror neurons, and their mirror neurons are less active overall. So they're not as good at, anticipating other people's behaviors or at interacting in a social situation. All right. Any questions so far?
Yeah, what you said what you said the causes of autism were?
So there's a genetic predisposition. They have less developed prefrontal cortex, and then the mirror neurons.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.